It was early in the morning, and I was sitting at the kitchen table watching my coffee grow cold. The ceramic mug spun between my fingers. The blue floral pattern on it had blurred into something all too familiar. Gray light seeped through the window, casting faint shadows across the wooden surface of the table. Outside, the weather was overcast, much like the atmosphere inside me. My name is Adela Moreau. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 10 years I've been tirelessly working to stand on my own 2 feet. I make a living as a graphic designer, residing in a small apartment with a modest life I've built with my own hands. But this morning, I didn't yet know that everything was about to change. My phone vibrated on the table. The screen flashed my father's name, Victor. A wave of unease surged within me. Victor Moreau rarely called, especially not at 8 in the morning. I picked up the phone, hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and answered. "Adela," my father said, his voice as stern and commanding as ever. "You need to come home this afternoon. Family matter." "What matter?" I asked, trying to mask the exhaustion in my voice. My fingers tightened around the mug's handle. "Not something to discuss over the phone. Be here at 2. Then the line went dead. Classic Victor. No greeting, no goodbye. Just an order. I sipped my coffee, but it left a sour aftertaste in my mouth. Family matter, what did that even mean? Another one of Mom's hospital bills popping up? Or perhaps my sister Elise needed money for yet another big idea? Elise Moreau, 28, the golden child of the family. Beautiful, cheerful, and always expecting someone to swoop in and save her. And me? I'd always had to fend for myself. As 2 o'clock approached, I arrived at my father's house by Bearwood Lake. Tucked along the shore, shaded by pine trees, this wooden house was where I'd spent my childhood summers. But now it was just a burden I carried on my shoulders. Parking the car, I caught a familiar glimpse through the window. My father's broad back pacing the living room, casting shadows, while my mother, Beatrice, sat in her usual spot on the couch, hands clasped in her lap, waiting silently. I knocked on the door. My father opened it. His face looked flushed with anger. His gray hair was disheveled, his brows furrowed. "You're late," he said, not even glancing at the clock. 5 minutes, I corrected, slipping off my coat. Traffic was heavy. Entering the living room, I saw Elise. She was perched on the edge of the couch, fiddling with her phone, a slight smile playing on her lips. Her blonde hair spilled over her shoulders, and the cream-colored sweater she wore gave her an innocent air. But I'd long since started questioning that innocence. "Adela, sit," my father said, his voice heavy with authority. He gestured to the chair across from him. I sat, but the unease inside me grew. On the coffee table sat an envelope, its corner slightly torn, bearing an official logo. My eyes lingered on it, but my father's voice pulled my attention away as he began to speak. "Elise has a business idea," he said, puffing out his chest. "She wants to open her own boutique bakery. We found a small place in Bearwood, but she needs some startup capital." I paused for a moment. My gaze shifted to Elise. She was still engrossed in her phone, as if this conversation didn't concern her. "How much capital?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though something inside me began to simmer. $50,000, my father said, locking eyes with me. "And we need your help." My hand instinctively gripped the armrest. "My help? Why are you expecting this from me?" My father's expression hardened. "Adela, how can you be so selfish?" he snapped, his voice reverberating through the room. "Your sister has a dream. You've already built your own business, you're making money. This is Elise's chance." Selfishness. The word lodged in my throat like a lump. For years, I'd been the one paying the property taxes on this house, $12,000 every year, quietly deducted from my bank account to keep this place afloat. When Mom's cancer treatments weren't fully covered by insurance, I'd footed the bill. Elise's car payments last year? I'd covered those too because she needed to boost her credit score. And now they were asking for $50,000 more, all for Elise's dream. "Victor," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I've been carrying this family's burdens for years. The vacation home's taxes, Mom's bills, Elise's expenses. I've never heard a single thank you. And now you want more from me?" My mother lifted her head, looking at me for the first time. Her eyes were misty, but her voice was soft. "Adela, sweetie," she said in that familiar, soothing tone. "Elise needs more help than you do. You've always been strong, independent. We're proud of you." Proud. That word broke something inside me. They were proud, but that pride had never gained me anything. On the contrary, I was being punished for my successes. Looking at Elise, my stomach churned. She was still buried in her phone, as if this argument had nothing to do with her. "What about my needs?" I said, my voice low but sharp. "Why didn't you help me when I was in college? Where were you when I worked nights at a cafe and ran to classes during the day? When I started my first business, drowning in debt, why didn't anyone give me a single cent?" My father shifted uncomfortably. "Things were different back then, Adela. But now Elise has a chance." I cut him off, my eyes darting to the envelope on the table. "A chance? What chance?" My hand reached for it despite my father shouting, "Adela, stop!" I opened it. Inside was a document written in cold official language, trust fund in the name of Elise Moreau. Initial amount $75,000. Then for additional contributions. My hand trembled. $75,000. All those years they'd told me, "We don't have money." This had been sitting aside for Elise. "When were you going to tell me about this?" I whispered, the anger in my voice now impossible to hide. My father snatched the document from my hand, but it was too late. The numbers were etched into my mind. "You weren't supposed to see that," he muttered, folding the envelope. "Clearly," I said, standing up. "This explains why I've always had to fend for myself." I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. "I'm done paying the taxes on this house. Figure it out yourselves." When I slammed the door behind me, the cold wind off the lake hit my face. But the fire inside me burned hot enough to overpower even that breeze. In that moment, I felt the ties to my family begin to fray. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward my freedom. My hands were still trembling as I got into my car. I slid the key into the ignition but paused before starting the engine. Through the windshield, I stared at the still waters of Bearwood Lake, the gray sky reflected on its surface like a fractured mirror. As a child, I'd swum in that lake with Elise. She'd float on her bright red buoy while I sat on the shore, listening to Mom call out, "Adela, keep an eye on your sister." Back then, I saw it as a duty, a natural part of being the older sister. But now? Now even those memories left a bitter taste in my mouth. I started the engine, shifted into gear, and pressed the gas pedal without looking back at the house. My father's shouts, my mother's fake gentle tone, Elise's indifferent smile, they were all behind me. But a voice inside whispered, "You won't escape this so easily." It was right. Even if I'd physically distanced myself from them, my mind was still in that living room, wrestling with the cold truth of that envelope. Driving back to the city, the pine trees passed by like shadows along the road. I turned on the radio, but the cheerful melody of the song made my stomach churn. I switched it off and surrendered to the silence. My thoughts drifted to the dusty shelves of the past. My college years, working freelance gigs at night to pay rent while rushing to classes during the day. My father's words, "You need to find your own way, Adela." Meanwhile, Elise, at the same age, had gone to art school with our parents' support, spending her weekends with friends. My weekends were filled with the smell of coffee and the clatter of a keyboard. When I got home, I opened the door to my small apartment. The faded blue paint on the walls, the simple IKEA furniture, the drawing tablet on my desk. This was my sanctuary, a fortress I'd built with my own hands. But that day, even this fortress felt confining. I dropped my bag on the floor, tossed my coat onto the couch, and shuffled to the kitchen. I filled a glass with water but leaned against the counter and took a deep breath before drinking. $75,000, I said to myself, my voice echoing in the empty room. $75,000 for Elise. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen. A message from Mom. Adela, please calm down and come back. Your father's very upset. We need to talk. I read it but set the phone on the counter without replying. Upset, was he? What about me? Every disappointment I'd silently swallowed over the years, but Elise needs its sentence, now sat like a lump in my throat. I moved to the living room and sank onto the couch. My eyes caught an old photo on the wall. It was from a family vacation 5 years ago, the 4 of us smiling on the shore of Bearwood Lake. Dad's arms were around Elise's shoulders, Mom was hugging her. I stood off to the side, holding a book. I hadn't noticed it then, but now it was painfully clear. I was always on the sidelines. The family's invisible hero, the quiet supporter. But even heroes get tired, don't they? My phone buzzed again. This time it was Elise. Adela, why are you making such a big deal out of this? Dad just wants to help me. You already have everything. I clenched my teeth as I read it. Everything? I muttered. My hand hovered over the phone and I started typing a reply. Elise, you think I have everything? What about the $75,000 set aside for you? But I deleted it before sending. What was the point? She'd never understand. I got up, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. I logged into my bank account. I'd set up an automatic payment for the property taxes on the Bearwood Lake house every year. When the page loaded, I saw the last payment had gone through 2 months ago, $12,000. With one click, I canceled the auto payment. When the screen flashed, transaction confirmed, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It was as if a chain had snapped off my shoulders. But at the same time, an emptiness grew. Could I really let them go? That evening, while boiling pasta in the kitchen, my phone rang again. It was Dad this time. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, and after a few minutes, I mustered the courage to listen. Adela, he said, his voice angry but weary. What you're doing is so wrong. You're turning your back on your family when we need you. Aren't you ashamed of ruining Elise's dream? Call us back immediately. I turned off the phone. I plated the pasta, but I had no appetite. I picked up the fork, then set it down. Elise's dream, I said to myself with a mocking smile. And what about my dreams? When did they ever matter? That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling. In the darkness, the image of that lakeside house flickered in my mind. The laughter of my childhood, summer days spent with Elise. But then, the cold letters of that envelope overshadowed everything. $75,000. Money that was never there for me. And in that moment, I decided I wouldn't carry their burdens anymore. I didn't need anyone to prove my worth. Maybe true independence began with cutting those ties. When I woke up in the morning, the sunlight streaming through the window dazzled my eyes. I lay in bed for a while, staring at the fine cracks in the ceiling as my mind churned with thoughts from last night. My phone was still on silent. My father's voicemail lingered on the table like an unanswered shadow. I got up, walked barefoot to the kitchen, and started the coffee machine. The scent of black coffee filled the room, momentarily calming the storm inside me. But only for a moment. As I sat at the table, my gaze drifted to that family photo on the wall. The anger I'd felt staring at it last night was still fresh, but this morning something else accompanied it: determination. I wouldn't live in the shadow of that house, that lake, or that family anymore. I took a sip of my coffee. Its bitter taste spread across my tongue as I said to myself, "Today is a new beginning." My voice echoed and faded in the quiet of my small apartment. I opened my laptop and started on my work. I replied to a few client emails and sketched some ideas for a logo design. As my hand gripped the pencil, the lines flowed smoothly across the paper. This was my world. Here I was in control, here I was seen. But just then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Another message from Elise. "Adela, Dad's really stressed. Why did you cancel the tax payments? You can't do this to us." Reading the message, my lips twisted involuntarily. "You can't do this to us, huh?" She'd written it without a thought for what they'd done to me all these years. My finger hovered over the screen to type a reply, but then I stopped. No. This time, my silence would speak. I flipped the phone face down and returned to my work. In the afternoon, I went grocery shopping. Wandering the aisles of the small store a few streets from my apartment, my hand reached for the basics out of habit: bread, milk, a pack of pasta. But then I paused. I added a bottle of red wine to my basket. Tonight I'll treat myself, I thought. It should be a reward for all the time I'd spent on my own. Cashier, a young woman, smiled at me. "Nice choice," she said as she bagged the wine. "Thank you," I replied, and in that moment I realized this simple exchange felt more genuine than any approval I'd ever gotten from my family. On my way home, my phone rang again. It was Mom this time. I didn't answer, but I couldn't resist listening to the voicemail. "Adela, sweetie," she said, her voice trembling. "Your father's furious. He said you canceled the tax payments. Please come back and let's fix this. We all need to support each other." When the message ended, I picked up the phone and for a moment pictured my mother's face. Those soft eyes, that voice always trying to calm me down. But this time it didn't work. "Support," I said quietly, "was always one-sided." That evening, as I sipped my wine in the kitchen, I made a decision. I'd sever all ties with the Bearwood Lake house. Stopping the tax payments was a start, but I needed to do more. I opened my laptop again and began drafting an email to my father. "Victor, for years I've shouldered the costs of that house alone. Property taxes, maintenance, even last summer's roof repair, it all came from me. But I'm done. When I found out about the $75,000 you set aside for Elise, everything became clear. My sacrifices were never seen because you labeled me strong and independent. That house is your responsibility now, not mine. Adela." When I hit send, a wave of relief washed over me. But at the same time, a sadness settled in. That house was part of my childhood. Days swimming in the lake with Elise, evenings when Mom baked us cakes in the kitchen. But those memories were just an illusion now. The reality was the cold numbers in that envelope. My phone buzzed again. A reply from Dad. "Adela, what you've done is unforgivable. If you don't want to be part of this family, so be it. But you'll face the consequences of this decision." I smiled as I read it. "Consequences," I said to myself. "I've been living with yours for years. Now it's my turn." I took another sip of wine and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights flickered. This was my world, my shore. For the first time, I was breathing for myself, free of my family's shadow. But part of me still wondered, was this freedom or loneliness? Maybe it was both. A week had passed. Though the shadow of the Bearwood Lake house still lingered in my mind like a ghost, my days were starting to feel lighter. Each morning, I drink my coffee and settle at my desk, immersing myself in my drawing tablet. One of my clients had requested a new brand design for a cafe. As I worked on color palettes and typography options, I barely noticed the hours slipping by. This was my space, a world under my control. But that morning, when my doorbell rang, I realized how fragile that control could be. I opened the door and saw Elise. She wore a thin trench coat, her blonde hair swaying slightly in the breeze. Her hands were in her pockets, her face bearing that familiar, innocent expression. "Adela," she said, her voice cheerful but tense. "Can we talk?" I hesitated for a moment. I didn't want to invite her in, but I left the door open and walked inside. "What do you want?" I asked, heading to the kitchen. Elise followed, the heels of her boots clicking lightly on the hardwood floor. "I made it to your living room and it's still the same," she said, glancing around. She sat on my couch, placing her bag beside her. "Dad's really angry, you know. Ever since you sent that email, there's been no peace at home." I poured another cup from the coffee machine but didn't offer her any. "Peace," I said, leaning against the counter. "What an interesting word. I've been sacrificing for your peace for years. Is it my turn to start causing trouble now?" Elise frowned, her innocent mask slipping a little. "Adela, why are you blowing everything out of proportion? Yes, Dad's helping me, but that doesn't concern you. You've already built your own life. I need something too." A laugh escaped me, sharp and cutting. "Doesn't concern me? Elise, I paid the taxes on that house. I covered Mom's bills. I took care of your car payments. And now I find out you have a $75,000 trust fund, and you're still asking me for something?" Elise's face flushed, but she didn't look away. "That money's for my future," she said, her voice defensive. "Dad and Mom want to support me. I'm not in some competition with you." "Competition," I said, weighing the word in my mouth. "No, this isn't a competition. It's you always being one step ahead while I'm left cleaning up after you." I set the coffee mug on the counter, gripping the edge tightly to keep my hands from shaking. You know, there was a month in college when I ate nothing but pasta. I scraped by to pay my rent. What were you doing then? "Painting in the studio Dad bought for you." Elise stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "Why are you doing this to me?" she said, her voice trembling but her anger clear. "It's not my fault you chose the hard way. You're the one who wanted to be independent. I had to be independent," I shouted, my voice echoing off the apartment walls. "Because you never left me any other choice. Looking after you, carrying the family's burdens, it all fell on me. But it's over now." Elise froze for a moment, her eyes welling up, but she didn't cry. "You know what?" she said, heading for the door. "Dad was right. You really are selfish." She slammed the door behind her. After she left, I sank onto the couch. My heart pounded in my chest, but oddly, I felt lighter. Selfish. That word had come from my father's mouth too. But now, for the first time, I wondered if it wasn't an insult but a freedom. Choosing my own life was selfish, then so be it. That evening, I returned to my desk. I looked at the sketches for the cafe project. The colors were vibrant, the lines bold. This was my signature, my worth. My phone buzzed, a message from Dad. "Adela, you upset Elise. What are you trying to do to this family?" I deleted it without replying. I was done trying to see myself in their mirror. That mirror was shattered. I walked to the window and opened it. Cool city air rushed in as I took a deep breath. Outside, the street lamps illuminated the asphalt. "This is my life," I said to myself. "And now it's mine alone." In that moment, I was ready to step out of the shadows of the past and find my own light. Days chased one another, but now, every morning when I woke up, there was a lightness inside me. The sunlight filtering through my apartment window hit the sketchbook on my desk as I sipped my coffee and started a new project. Cafe design had been completed and met with praise from the client. An email saying, "You did an amazing job, Adela," had sparked a small but real sense of triumph within me. This was my victory, something I'd earned without leaning on anyone's shadow. That morning, as I prepared breakfast in the kitchen, the radio was on. A soft jazz melody filled the room. The gentle notes of the trumpet added a calm rhythm to my mind. The smell of bread popping out of the toaster promised a simple, peaceful moment. Just then, my doorbell rang. I frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone. Setting the knife on the counter, I walked to the door. When I opened it, I saw my mother. Beatrice stood there with a small bag in hand, her face weary but resolute. Her gray hair was tied into a bun, though a few strands had escaped. "Adela," she said, her voice as soft as ever but carrying a hint of fragility this time. "Can I come in?" I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door wider. "Sure," I said, my tone neutral. The scent of coffee wafted from the kitchen. As she stepped inside, she sniffed lightly. "Did you make coffee?" she asked, placing the bag on the table. "Yes," I replied, not offering her a cup. "What do you want, Mom?" She sat on the couch, clasping her hands in her lap. That familiar gesture hadn't changed since my childhood. "Adela," she said, looking into my eyes, "you've torn our family apart. Your father can't sleep at night. Elise is crying. Nothing's been the same since that email." Torn apart. The word hung in the air. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms over my chest. "I'm not the one who tore this family apart," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "For years, I held everything together. Taxes, bills, Elise's whims. But what did I get in return? A trust fund? No, that went to Elise." My mother lowered her head, staring at her hands. "That money was for her future," she said, her voice nearly a whisper. "You always found your own way. You were strong. Elise, she's more fragile." "Fragile," I repeated, the word laced with mockery. "And what about me? Where were you when I didn't sleep during college, when I couldn't pay my rent, when I asked for help? You told me, find your own way. I did. But now, as I walk that path, why do I feel guilty?" She lifted her eyes, and they were wet. "We don't want you to feel guilty," she said. "Just don't completely abandon us, Adela. We love you." "Love," I said, feeling something break inside me. Is love loading burdens onto my back while pampering Elise? Is love ignoring my successes to fund her dreams? Mom, I was a tool for you. But not anymore. She fell silent for a moment, then pulled a small box from the bag. "I brought this for you," she said, placing it on the table. "Something from your childhood. Maybe you'll remember." I took the box and opened it. Inside was an old necklace from a summer at the lake. A tiny seashell dangled from it. Elise and I had made it together, decorating it with paint. My fingers brushed the shell's rough surface, but nothing stirred inside me. "Why did you bring this?" I asked, closing the box and handing it back. "Because you're still part of this family," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't just erase us." I sat on the couch, looking at her. "I'm not erasing you," I said, choosing each word carefully. "But I won't erase myself for you anymore. That house, those responsibilities, those expectations, they're yours. My life is here, in this apartment, in the lines I draw on this table." She stood, picking up her bag but leaving the necklace on the table. "Your father will be so upset if he hears this," she said, heading for the door. "Let him hear it," I said, my voice firm. "His sadness isn't my burden anymore." When the door closed, I looked at the necklace. I picked it up for a moment, then put it in a drawer. Past could stay there. I grabbed my toast from the kitchen, sat at my desk, and returned to my drawing tablet. I opened a new project on the screen, a blank page, infinite possibilities. I took my stylus and drew the first line. This was my story, and now it belonged only to me. That evening, I sipped my wine and gazed out at the city from my window. The lights still flickered, but this time they seemed to whisper something to me. You are enough! And for the first time, I believed it. A few weeks had passed, but the peace inside me hadn't fully settled. My days were filled with work, sketches, and small routines. Morning coffee, evening wine, watching the city lights from my window. Yet sometimes, in the silence of the night, the still waters of Bearwood Lake crept into my mind. That house, those memories, that burden, I thought I'd left them behind, but a part of me was still there, tangled like an unresolved knot. That morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox. My father's handwriting was scrawled across it, Adela Moreau. My heart quickened for a moment. I hesitated as my hand reached for it. A voice inside me whispered, "Don't open it," but curiosity won out. I tore it open and pulled out the letter. My father's sharp, angular letters lined the page. Adela, your decision about the house has put us all in a difficult spot. The taxes haven't been paid, and we got a notice this month. We tried to get a loan from the bank for Elise's bakery project, but it wasn't enough. Everything's falling apart because of you. Give us another chance. Come to the house on Saturday, let's talk. Victor. I set the letter on the table and covered my face with my hands. Because of me, I said to myself, a mocking smile curling my lips. I'd kept that house standing for years, but now I was the one to blame. I glanced at the letter again. The phrase, "Give us another chance," caught my eye. Chance. How many chances had I given them? But this time was different. This could be the final confrontation. On Saturday morning, I drove toward Bearwood Lake. Pine trees passed by like shadows along the road, but this time there was a resolve inside me. I turned off the radio, leaving myself alone with the hum of the engine and my thoughts. When I arrived, the wooden house on the lake shore stood as it always had, though a few roof tiles had shifted and the grass in the yard had grown wild. It was as if my absence had drained the house of its spirit too. I knocked on the door. My father opened it. His face looked more sunken than before, the circles under his eyes darker. Adela, he said, his voice weary. You came. To talk, I said, stepping inside. In the living room, my mother and Elise were there. Mom sat in her usual chair, hands clasped in her lap. Elise stood by the window, arms crossed over her chest. When she looked at me, there was anger in her eyes, but beneath it, something else, desperation. Adela, my father said, gesturing for me to sit at the table. You know the situation. The house is slipping away. We don't have the money for the taxes. Elise's project is on hold. You need to help us. I sat at the table but kept my hands off it. Help, I said, weighing the word. I've been helping for years. But what did you do? You stashed money away for Elise and left me on the sidelines. And now you expect me to be your savior again? Elise stepped forward, her voice sharpening. Everything's ruined because of you. If you hadn't canceled those taxes, Dad wouldn't be this stressed. I'd have a chance with my bakery. Because of me? I said, turning to her. Elise, $75,000 was set aside for your bakery. Where did that money go? Dance lessons? Vacations? Do you know what I was doing then? Struggling to pay off debts and survive. My father slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. Enough. Adela, you're turning your back on your family. This house is your childhood too. How can you forget that? My eyes shifted to him, then to the window overlooking the lake. I haven't forgotten, I said, my voice low but steady. But that childhood was an illusion. I was a support beam for you, nothing more. Now that beam's gone and your house is shaking. That's not my fault. My mother started crying, covering her mouth with her hand. Adela, please, she said, her voice muffled. Don't leave us like this. I stood, grabbing my coat. I'm not leaving you, I said, heading for the door. I'm leaving you to yourselves. This house, this burden, this life, it's not mine anymore. Find your own way. As I opened the door, the cold lake wind hit my face. I heard my father's voice behind me. Adela, you can't come back here again. But it didn't sound like a threat, it felt like a promise. I got into my car, started the engine, and took one last look at the house. The lake's water reflected the gray sky, but this time I didn't see myself in that reflection. Driving back to the city, there was an emptiness inside me, but also a fullness. When I got home, I sat at my desk and opened a new sketchbook. I drew a single line on the first page, straight, simple, but strong. This is my path, I said to myself. And in that moment, the echoes of the past finally fell silent. A month had passed since that last confrontation at Bearwood Lake. My days now flowed to my own rhythm. I no longer woke to the sound of an alarm, but to the sunlight filtering into my apartment. The coffee machine remained my most loyal companion. Each cup felt like a quiet celebration of a new day. My sketchbook on the desk was no longer filled with half-finished projects, but with completed works. My life was slowly taking a shape that belonged to me. That morning, when I opened the window, the air felt different. It was late March, and the city carried the scent of early spring, fresh grass, a faint floral breeze. There was no trace of the lake wind from Bearwood here. I breathed in, my lungs filling as a sense of relief spread through me. A new season, I said to myself, smiling. Perhaps this renewal wasn't just nature's, it was mine too. As I sat at my desk, an email caught my eye. An art gallery was inviting local designers to an exhibition. Join us with a piece that tells your story, the invitation read. I paused, my pencil hovering in the air. What was my story? A woman lost in her family's shadow for years, then breaking free to find her own light. My fingers gripped the pencil, and I drew the first line in my sketchbook, the silhouette of a lake with a solitary figure standing on its shore, holding a lantern. I worked on that drawing all day. As the lake's gray waters came to life on the page, I gave the figure a stance of determination. The lantern's light became a small but bright spot on the paper. Hours passed, but I didn't notice time slipping by. This wasn't just a job, it was a redefinition of myself. By evening, the drawing was finished. I named it The Shore's Lantern. I took a photo and sent it to the gallery. When I hit send, a spark ignited within me. A few days later, a reply came from the gallery. Adela, your piece has been accepted for the exhibition. We'd love to see you at the opening night. Reading the message, my lips curved into an involuntary smile. For the first time, something was entirely mine. No expectations, no burdens, just something I'd created. On the night of the exhibition, I stood in front of my mirror. I wore a black dress, simple, but it made me feel strong. I left my hair down and looked at my reflection. There was a difference in my eyes. Once filled with exhaustion and shadows, they now carried a glimmer of hope. You're ready, I said to myself, grabbing my bag and heading to the door. The gallery was a small but elegant space in the city center. As I stepped inside, I was greeted by the sight of artworks hanging on the walls and the murmur of people around me. The Shore's Lantern stood in a corner, my name beneath it, Adela Moreau. I stood beside it, took a sip of wine, and watched the crowd. A few people paused in front of my drawing, whispering. One asked their friend, "Is this loneliness or strength?" I smiled. Perhaps it was both. That night, a woman approached me. Middle-aged, wearing glasses, she held a notebook in her hand. "Adela Moreau?" she asked, smiling. I nodded. "I'm Clara, the gallery's curator. Your piece is striking. What's its story?" I paused for a moment, then took a deep breath. "It's my story of finding myself," I said, my eyes drifting to the drawing. "For years, I lived on the shore of a lake for others. But one day, I walked away from that lake and lit my own light." Clara nodded, jotting something in her notebook. "That's a powerful message," she said. "We'd love to see more of your work. You have talent." "Thank you," I said, a warmth spreading inside me. As Clara walked away, I looked at my drawing again. That figure was me, alone but not weak. Strong because she'd chosen her own path. When I got home, I opened the window. The city lights still flickered, but this time they seemed to sing to me. I sat at my desk and opened a new sketchbook. On the first page, I drew a flower, a spring bud. "This is me," I said to myself. And I'm still growing. Since the exhibition, my days had found a rhythm, but it was one that now aligned with my own desires rather than anyone else's expectations. Mornings were spent sipping coffee and sitting at my desk, working on new projects. The gallery opening had brought me a few opportunities. A local magazine wanted to collaborate with me on a cover design. As I played with colors and shapes on my drawing tablet, each stroke helped me discover a little more of myself. My life was budding like a spring branch. That afternoon, I returned from the grocery store, hands full of bags, and entered my apartment building. Climbing the stairs, I spotted someone standing in front of my door. I stopped, narrowing my eyes. It was Elise. She wore a thin jacket, hands in her pockets, head slightly bowed. Her blonde hair spilled over her shoulders, but it lacked its usual shine. A wave of unease rose within me, but then I took a deep breath. This was my space. I was in control. "Adela," she said, straightening as she saw me. There was a hesitancy in her voice, a tone I wasn't used to. "Can we talk for a bit?" I set the bags down and slid the key into the lock. "Come in," I said, my voice neutral. I opened the door and she slipped inside behind me. She glanced around my apartment, the sketches on my desk, the empty frame on the wall, the faint coffee scent drifting from the kitchen. "This place hasn't changed," she said, but I couldn't tell if it was a compliment or a critique. "What do you want, Elise?" I asked, carrying the bags to the kitchen. I didn't offer her coffee, that was a boundary line. Elise sat on the couch, clasping her hands in her lap. "The house was sold," she said, avoiding my gaze. "We couldn't pay the taxes. Dad tried to get a loan, but it wasn't enough. Last week, a family bought it." I paused, my hand freezing on the counter. The Bearwood Lake house, that wooden refuge of my childhood, now belonged to someone else. A pang flickered inside me, but it wasn't as deep as I'd expected. "I'm sorry," I said, though there was distance in my tone. "But that's not my problem." Elise lifted her head, her eyes misty. "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "But everything's changed, Adela. The bakery project fell through too. The money wasn't enough, and I don't know what to do." I looked at her, searching for that familiar, innocent expression, but this time it was different. There was desperation on her face, as if she were lost in her own shadow for the first time. "Elise," I said slowly, "for years everything was handed to you, on my back, in Dad's plans and Mom's silence. But now you have to find your own way." "Like you," she said, a hint of a jab in her voice, though it was feeble. "Independent, strong Adela?" I smiled, but it wasn't a bitter smile. "Yes," I said, "but I learned that the hard way. You'll have to learn it too." Elise fell silent for a moment, then picked up her bag. "Dad blames you," she said, standing. "But I think I knew you were right. I just didn't want to admit it. Her words hung in the air. I didn't say anything. I walked her to the door. "Take care of yourself," I said, and it was genuine. When I closed the door behind her, a sense of relief spread through me. Elise's visit felt like the last echo from the past, but this time that echo hadn't shaken me. That evening, I sat at my desk and continued working on the magazine cover. The design resembled a spring branch, buds blooming, colors coming to life. When it was finished, I looked at the screen and said to myself, "This is me." The shadow of the lake was gone. In its place was a spring I'd nurtured with my own hands. I walked to the window and opened it. Cool evening air brushed against my face. The city lights still flickered, but this time they seemed to offer me a promise. Keep going. And I was ready to do just that. The days after Elise's visit flowed quietly. My apartment was no longer just a refuge. It had become a home. The sketchbooks on my desk were filled with completed projects. The magazine cover had been printed, and a new offer had come from the gallery. My life was like a painting I'd crafted with my own hands. I chose the colors, I set the frame. The shadow of Bearwood Lake lingered in my mind as a mere memory. It hadn't faded entirely, but it no longer weighed me down. One morning, I took my coffee and sat by the window. It was early April. Outside, the small tree in front of the apartment building had sprouted its first blossoms. White buds gleamed in the morning sun. I brought the mug to my lips, the warm coffee sliding down my throat as a sense of peace spread within me. My phone buzzed on the table. A message had arrived. I glanced at the screen. It was from Mom. "Adela, I walked by the lake yesterday. The new owners have fixed up the garden. It looks nice. I thought of you." I smiled as I read it. I could almost hear my mother's voice, that soft, slightly fragile tone. I hesitated for a moment, then typed a reply. "I'm glad it looks nice. I'm doing well, too. Take care." I sent it. It wasn't reconciliation, perhaps, but it was acceptance. The distance between us remained, but I no longer held any resentment. That afternoon, a package arrived. When I opened the door, the courier handed me a small box. "Adela Moreau?" he asked. I nodded and took it. Inside, I placed it on the table and opened it curiously. There was a note and a photograph inside. The note was in Elise's handwriting. "Adela, this belongs to you. Maybe you'll remember. I found a job waitressing. I'm earning my own money now. It's not easy, but it's not bad either." I looked at the photo, a snapshot from our childhood. We were sitting on the lake shore, Elise and I. I held that seashell necklace and we were smiling. On the back was a date, summer 1998. I closed the box, but this time I didn't tuck it away in a drawer. I left it on the table. Elise's words stirred something inside me. Maybe she too was finding her own path, just like I had. In the late afternoon, I sat at my desk and started a new drawing. This time it was a flower, a spring bud, delicate yet strong. As the lines flowed onto the paper, my mind settled. The echoes of the lake, my family's expectations, the burdens I'd carried for years, they were all in the past. When I finished the drawing, I signed it, Adela Moreau. It wasn't just a name anymore, it was my story. That night, I opened the window. The city lights twinkled as always, but this time they seemed to tell me a story. I took a deep breath, the spring air filling my lungs. "I'm whole," I said to myself. I wasn't searching for a missing piece anymore. I was complete, standing in this moment. The next morning, I took my coffee and sat at my desk. I opened a blank page for a new project. With pencil in hand, I drew the first line. That line was a beginning, not on the shore of a lake, not in someone else's shadow. It was the first flower of my spring. And I was rooted, ready to bloom.